Okay, well, hello everyone. Nice response. That's going well. It's going to be one of those kinds of crowds. I want to talk today about this idea when God changes things. When we look in Scripture and we read the different stories in the Bible, we discover that about the Lord, that He changes things. And He does that for a lot of different reasons, sometimes to get us moving, sometimes to regain our focus on Him. Sometimes to purify our lives, sometimes just to test us. But in any case, if we just stay close to Him when He's changing things, He always draws us near to Himself in that process. I was thinking about, just as I said that, I was thinking about that. I was a young man in my 20s. And I was driving a semi truck, and I don't remember where I was, somewhere on the East Coast. I was in Virginia or something, and I was having a lot of truck issues. And my dad had been a truck mechanic, and the problem with machinery is it breaks. And so, that's my theory on owning machinery. But I would call him and I'd say it's doing this or it's doing that. What do I do? How do I? And he'd answer on the phone, and then I'd go work on that and do that. And it was one thing after another. And it was one of those deals where you're up all night and you're just doing this. And there's one. It seemed like there was just a series of crises that took place. And Debbie and Ashley were at home, and I was alone on the road, and all these things were happening. And I remember telling my dad on the phone, he says, well, are you okay? Spiritually, are you okay with the Lord? And I said, yeah. I said, I've decided that every time Satan attacks me, I'm going to run closer to the Lord. And that way Satan might get tired of attacking me because it's counterproductive, right? And I think back on those days, and what a wonderful formula that's been in my life. And I'm not in my 20s anymore. So, I'm in my 60s. And I'm younger than Les Smith, though, by a week. And so, yeah. So he doesn't look that bad, but, that's the way it is. And, come to think of that, I'm just going to tell you something about Mikey Rutherford, because I'm sour grapes about that. And so he came to help me on the roof, which I'm not sour grapes about that, except that help part. I just want him to do, and I don't want to help. But we're on the roof, and he's climbing down off the roof, and he says, how old are you? And I said, well, I'm 61. I'll be 62 in April. So in April, you can buy presents. And he says, well, how old is Debbie? I said, well, she's the same age I am. He goes, wow, she's aged well. He says, I've known her almost my whole life, and she seems the same. I'm like, what are you trying to say about me? He's just diplomatically as possible. He says, Debbie's really aged well. I said, well, no, what are you intimating about me right now? He says, Debbie's aged so well. He's such a punk. He's middle-aged punk, but he still is. And anyhow, I totally lost my place. When God changes things, we should draw near to the Lord. And in that, we find refuge. And some of you are still stuck on the fact that Debbie looks young and I don't, because living with me is like the fountain of youth. So that explains it right there. So if some of you look old, it's your spouse's fault. You heard it here. So have you noticed the changes in the last couple years? Maybe even a few more in our nation and around us and our culture and our circumstances. I think you've noticed some of the changes. You're all wearing masks. You've noticed some changes. And you know, in that process, have you heard people talking about, you know, the good old days? You know, the good old days syndrome happens to a lot of old people. My uncle, when he was like 93 or something ridiculous like that. He lived at the time. He's gone, but he he's my mother's brother. He lived in Comanche, Texas, and you know, you say, well, what do you think of Comanche, Texas? I think Hades is a local phone call from there, but it's just Comanche, Texas. But and my mother's family is from there, and so on. But we're driving out, and so his idea was to show me all the tombstones of my ancestors. It was a real good time, and we that's what we did. Honestly, we went around and we looked at tombstones of people I'd never met that had my mother's maiden name. And but I loved going to visit him because my aunt would make fried okra and stuff. But in any case, he loved country music, right? He thought there were two kinds of music, country and Western. And so we're listening, and there was a song that was popular at the time came on. You know, the grandpa tell me about the good old days. And he says, you know, I don't remember him like that. We were hungry a lot of times. We had trials. And have you ever noticed when people start thinking about the good old days, they forget about the hardships of the good old days and they just remember the good old days? And I was talking to a guy the other day out by the lighthouse, and we were talking about different things, and he was expressing concerns about the upcoming generation. He's a baby boomer as well, and we were talking, and I said, you know, I was born late in life to, you know, and my parents were World War II generation. And I said, you know, all the things that I hear old people saying about young people today are the things my parents said about them. Think about that. You know, they just don't have a clue. What will our country do when they're in charge? Well, never mind. That's a good argument. But what will we do? Where are we headed? They don't have a work ethic. They don't have a sense of responsibility. And guess who they were talking about? All the old people that are in the room right now saying things like that about the next coming generations. It's an interesting. I bet Moses said stuff like that about Joshua. He just didn't write it down. Because it's kind of our thing. We don't like change. The only people that like change are the ones who think of it. And so you hear people saying, if only we could go back to those good old days. Right? That's that. You remember, the Israelites did that. You know, you're like, well, you got to talk about the Bible. I will. Trust me, there's plenty of scriptures today. But remember the Israelites. What were they in Egypt before the Exodus? Slaves. And what were they doing? Complaining. And why were they complaining? Because they were mistreated. And to great extents, they were overworked. They didn't have all that they needed. There was even a mandate over whether or not they could have boy children. And all these things were happening to them. It was a horrible time in their history. But when God changed things, they started saying, do you remember the good food we had in Egypt? And how great it was there? They forgot that God delivered them from something. And if you're not careful, when God blesses your life with change, you won't notice that God delivered you from something. And it brings us to this question. Where does our help come from? And we know it comes from the Lord. That's the right answer. How many think of that answer when you're angry and yelling at the television? Psalm 121, that's in Psalm 121, verses 1 through 3. We'll read those. A song for going up to worship. I look up toward the mountains where I can find help. My help comes from the Lord, the maker of heaven and earth. He will not let you fall. Your guardian will not fall asleep. And this is not something we should forget. This is something that should be in the forefront of our thinking. It should be something that becomes instinct, that our help comes from the Lord. That in every situation we breathe the prayer and trust in the Lord. Now sometimes God has to change things to remind us of where our hope comes from. And that's one of the things that change is about. It's God's way of reminding us in whom we trust. And I want to read a little story, or go over a story about Isaiah and King Uzziah. I'm going to read out of Isaiah chapter 6 to start with. And it's the story of the vision that Isaiah has in the throne room of God after Uzziah dies. And then we'll talk about that kind of stuff. And starting with verse 1 of Isaiah chapter 6, it says, in the year King Uzziah died, I saw the Lord sitting on a high and lofty throne. The bottom of his robe filled the temple. Angels were standing above him. Each had 6 wings. With 2 they covered their faces, with 2 they covered their feet, and with 2 they flew. They called to each other and said, Holy, holy, holy is the Lord of armies. The whole earth is filled with his glory. Their voices shook the foundations of the doorposts, and the temple filled with smoke. So I said, oh no, I'm doomed. Every word that passes through my lips is sinful. I live among people with sinful lips, and I have seen the King, the Lord of armies. Then one of the angels flew to me. In his hand was a burning coal that he had taken from the altar with tongs. He touched my mouth with it and said, this has touched your lips. Your guilt has been taken away and your sin has been forgiven. And I was thinking of a couple things as I was reading through this. I want to just make a little side note for us to remember. And the first is that the Lord's glory fills the whole earth. When you look around at this earth, and you consider living on this planet, and you think in terms of the weather and events, and whether it's the rain or whatever it is you don't like, the cold or this or that, here's what you have to remember. The glory of the Lord fills the whole earth. And I think of that, we can look outward and see the glory of the Lord filling the earth, and we can look inward and see the glory of the Lord filling the earth. And whether you'd use a telescope or a microscope, you can discover the glory of the Lord. And I think of what David said in Psalm 139, and he describes how the Lord wove him together in his mother's womb and numbered his days when as yet there were none. And he makes this powerful statement, and he says, and marvelous are your works, O Lord, and this my soul knows very well. And certainly there's healing for people spiritually if they begin to understand they really are a marvelous work of the Lord. But there's more healing if you understand that the people around you are marvelous works of the Lord. And that's one of the things God wants us to learn. That we look at people, and we look at people that we don't agree with, and people that are doing things that are wrong, and all of these things. But here's what we understand. There's still a marvelous work of God. There's still the image of God, what we call in theology the imago Dei. It's just Latin for image of God. And it's there. And we see it. That's why people who don't know the Lord continue to know how to love and care, because the image of God is there. Isn't that the glory of the Lord around you? And in this time of ours, we should be able to see that. Even in people that we disapprove of. And so that was the first thing I noticed that I didn't put in my notes. And the other thing was, well, I can't remember. Oh, here it is. When he says, woe is me, I'm a man," and it's verse 5. He says, woe am I, for I'm a man of unclean lips, and I dwell amongst people of unclean lips. And then he makes that statement, "For I have seen the King." Now, if we just take two statements out of that paragraph, there's an interesting thing that God has done through change. In the year King Uzziah died, I saw the King. When your hope dies, you will see the Lord, and he'll be high and lifted up. When things change in your life is an opportunity to see the Lord of heaven and the Lord of armies, the King of the universe. And I look at that and I think, what a marvelous experience. And we think about that, how many postmodern Christians, sometimes we get a little experience focused. And I understand that, because experiences with God are wonderful things to have, but they can't replace substance. That we see that with the story of Elijah. He goes into a cave, he's despondent, and there's lightning and earthquake and wind, and all this is happening. And it says, and God wasn't in